I sat in that federal courtroom watching my own mother point her trembling finger at me, like I was some common criminal. He never served, he made it all up, Patricia hissed, her voice cutting through the silence like broken glass. My half-brother Marcus nodded grimly from the gallery behind her, his arms crossed tight across his chest. $300,000. That's what they wanted from me in fraudulent veteran benefits. I didn't react to her words, didn't flinch when the whole courtroom turned to stare. I just kept my eyes on Judge Sarah Williams, a stern woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. As my mother finished her testimony, something strange happened. Judge Williams stood up slowly, her face completely unreadable, and began removing her black robe. 6 months earlier, I was living a quiet life in my studio apartment on the outskirts of Denver, working as a carpenter for Henderson Construction. At 32, I thought I had found some peace after everything I'd been through. The disability checks helped cover what my carpenter wages couldn't, and I was seeing a counselor at the VA for the nightmares that still woke me up screaming sometimes. That Tuesday morning changed everything. The knock on my door came at 7 sharp, and when I opened it, a process server handed me a manila envelope thick with legal documents. My hands actually shook as I read the plaintiff names: Patricia Miller, Roger Miller, Marcus Miller versus Darwin Miller. My own family was suing me. The allegations hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. According to the lawsuit, I had fabricated my entire military service to fraudulently collect disability benefits from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They claimed I was a liar, a thief, who had stolen valor from real veterans who actually sacrificed for their country. The amount they were seeking nearly made me collapse right there in my doorway. My mother had raised me alone until she married Roger when I was 15. Marcus was their biological son, together 5 years younger than me, and we'd never been particularly close. But I never imagined any of them capable of something like this. I called Patricia immediately, my voice cracking as I tried to understand what was happening. Her tone was ice cold, nothing like the woman who used to make me hot chocolate after school. "We know what you did, Darwin," she said without any warmth. "We found out about the lies. All those stories about Afghanistan, about your unit, about getting hurt over there. None of it happened." "Mom, what are you talking about? You know I served. You remember when I came back different, when I couldn't sleep, when loud noises made me dive for cover." "Acting," she replied flatly. "You were always dramatic as a kid. We should have seen through it sooner." The line went dead, and I stared at the phone like it might explode. This had to be some kind of mistake, some terrible misunderstanding that we could clear up once cooler heads prevailed. But as the weeks passed, I realized how wrong I was. The family had hired Kenneth Bradshaw, one of the most aggressive civil attorneys in Colorado. He was a shark in an expensive suit who specialized in fraud cases, and he came after me with everything he had. My girlfriend Jessica, who I'd been dating for 8 months, tried to be supportive at first. She worked as a nurse at Denver Health and had always been understanding about my PTSD episodes. But as the legal pressure mounted and the details of the case became public, I could see doubt creeping into her green eyes. "Darwin, honey," she said one evening as we sat in her apartment, legal papers scattered across her coffee table. "I've been thinking about some of the things you've told me about your deployment. Some of the details seem, I don't know, maybe a little unclear." That question hit harder than anything my family had thrown at me. If Jessica was starting to doubt me, how could I expect a jury to believe my side? The worst part was my own confusion about certain details. When I tried to find my old military records to prove my service, I kept running into dead ends. The National Personnel Records Center said they had no file under my name. My DD, 214 discharge papers, which I was sure I'd kept in a safe deposit box, had somehow vanished. Even my old military ID seemed to have disappeared from the shoebox where I kept important documents. Late at night, lying awake in my small apartment, I'd go through my memories of basic training at Fort Benning. I could remember the drill instructors screaming the endless push-ups, the smell of gun oil and boot polish. I remembered the flight to Bagram Air Base, the dusty mountains of Afghanistan, the weight of body armor in 110-degree heat. But when I tried to recall specific names of the guys in my unit or the exact dates of missions, everything became fuzzy around the edges. Maybe the trauma had affected my memory more than I realized. Maybe the family was right, and I'd somehow convinced myself that elaborate fantasies were real experiences. The legal discovery process was humiliating. Bradshaw's team requested every document I'd ever filed with the VA, every medical record, every piece of correspondence related to my military service claims. They interviewed neighbors, coworkers, anyone who might have heard me talk about my time in the Army. Roger. My stepfather gave a particularly damaging deposition. He'd always been a quiet man, who worked at the post office for 30 years. But in his sworn testimony, he painted me as a troubled teenager, who'd struggled with the truth from an early age. Darwin was always making up stories, Roger testified. Grand adventures, heroic scenarios where he was the main character. When he moved out at 18 and started talking about joining the military, Patricia and I thought it might help him mature. But then he started telling people he'd enlisted when we knew for a fact he was working at the tire shop. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Phone records showed I'd never been deployed overseas during the time I claimed to be in Afghanistan. My Social Security earnings statement indicated I'd been working civilian jobs continuously from age 18 through 24. There were no gaps that would suggest military service. Marcus, my half-brother, reluctantly testified that he'd always suspected something was off about my military stories. Darwin would tell different versions of the same events. He said during his deposition, sometimes he was infantry, sometimes he was a mechanic, sometimes he was in Afghanistan for 6 months, sometimes it was a full year. The details never stayed consistent. My court-appointed attorney, David Kim, did his best with what we had, but he looked increasingly defeated as each piece of evidence mounted against me. He was a young public defender who seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the case and the resources Bradshaw's firm was throwing at it. Darwin. He said during one of our meetings, his cheap suit wrinkled and his tie askew. I have to ask you directly, is there any possibility you might have convinced yourself that fantasies about military service actually happened? Sometimes trauma can manifest in unusual ways. Even my own lawyer was doubting me. I sat in that fluorescent-lit conference room at the public defender's office surrounded by case files and empty coffee cups, wondering if I was losing my mind. Maybe they were all right. Maybe I was just a pathetic wannabe who'd invented an elaborate fiction to make myself feel important. But deep down, somewhere in my gut, I knew they were wrong. I could still taste the dust from Afghan roads, still feel the vibration of helicopter rotors in my chest, still smell the cordite after firefights. Those weren't fantasies. They were memories burned into my soul. I just had to figure out how to prove it. The search for evidence of my service became an obsession that consumed every free moment. I took unpaid leave from Henderson Construction, telling my foreman Jake that I had family legal issues to resolve. He was understanding, having served 2 tours in Iraq himself, but I could see concern in his weathered face when I couldn't give him details. My first stop was the VA hospital, where I'd been receiving treatment for PTSD and hearing loss. Dr. Angela Rodriguez had been my psychiatrist for 3 years, and she knew my case better than anyone. Her office was small and cluttered with medical journals and patient files, a complete contrast to the sterile courthouse where my family was destroying my reputation. Darwin. I've reviewed your medical history extensively, Dr. Rodriguez said, pulling out a thick folder with my name on the tab. Your symptoms are absolutely consistent with combat exposure. The specific type of hearing damage you have typically results from proximity to explosive devices. Your PTSD presents with classic indicators of military trauma, not civilian stress disorders. She showed me audiograms documenting the high-frequency hearing loss in my left ear, exactly the pattern caused by IED explosions. She had session notes dating back to when I first sought treatment, describing nightmares about desert landscapes. guilt over civilian casualties, and hypervigilance behaviors common among infantry veterans. These aren't symptoms someone could fake consistently over multiple years, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Your physiological responses during our sessions, your sleep patterns, even your involuntary reactions to sudden sounds, all point to genuine combat exposure. Armed with her professional opinion, I drove to Colorado Springs to visit the Military Entrance Processing Station, where recruits ship out to basic training. The building was a nondescript government facility that looked more like a DMV than a gateway to military service. But walking through those doors triggered vivid memories. I could remember standing in line with 24 other nervous 18-year-olds, taking the oath of enlistment, getting my head shaved in preparation for the bus ride to Georgia. The staff sergeant who processed my paperwork had a thick Boston accent and a scar across his left temple. He joked about how I looked too young to be joining the infantry. But when I asked to see records of my enlistment, the civilian contractor at the front desk just shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can only access current processing records. Historical enlistment documents would be archived at the National Personnel Records Center, and they've already told you they don't have anything under your name." Frustrated, but not defeated, I spent hours online searching for any trace of my military service. I found message boards where veterans reconnected with old unit members, social media groups, organized by deployment location and time frame, even commercial websites that helped people track down former military colleagues. That's when I found Tommy Patterson, living in Phoenix. His Facebook profile picture showed a guy about my age wearing a baseball cap with a 2nd Infantry Division patch, the same unit I remembered serving with in Afghanistan. We had dozens of mutual friends who were all military veterans, and his posts frequently referenced experiences that matched my own memories. I sent him a private message explaining my situation, and his response came back within hours. "Holy shit, Darwin Miller. I was wondering what happened to you after we got back from Kandahar. You just disappeared. Call me." The 12-hour drive to Phoenix was the longest of my life. I kept second-guessing myself, wondering if I was about to meet a complete stranger who would expose me as a fraud. But when Tommy opened his apartment door and saw me standing there, his face immediately lit up with recognition. "Danny Morrison," he said using a name that sent chills down my spine. "I can't believe it's really you." Tommy looked older than his 31 years, with graying temples and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too much. His apartment was sparse, but neat, filled with military memorabilia and photographs from various deployments. He grabbed 2 beers from the refrigerator and motioned for me to sit on his worn leather couch. "You look exactly the same, man," he continued. "Maybe a little heavier, but the Army will do that to you once you're not running 5 miles every morning." We talked for hours, sharing memories that felt as real as anything I'd ever experienced. Tommy remembered our drill instructor at Fort Benning, a massive black man named Sergeant First Class Williams, who could do perfect push-ups for 10 straight minutes. He recalled the flight from Atlanta to Ramstein Air Base in Germany, then the connecting flight to Bagram, where we spent our first week in Afghanistan. "Remember that IED outside Kandahar that messed up your hearing?" Tommy asked, pointing to my left ear. "You were walking point when that thing went off about 50 feet ahead of us, tossed you into a drainage ditch and left you deaf for 2 days. Doc Jensen was convinced you had a concussion." The details were perfect, matching exactly what I remembered about the incident that had caused my hearing loss. But as we continued talking, Tommy grew increasingly uncomfortable. When I mentioned the lawsuit and my missing military records, his demeanor shifted completely. "Listen, Darwin, or Danny, whatever name you're using now," he said quietly, glancing toward his windows like someone might be watching. "You need to be very careful about this legal situation. There are some things about our deployment that were classified at levels way above our pay grade." "What are you talking about?" "We were just infantry grunts doing patrol duty." Tommy stood up and paced to his kitchen, running his hands through his hair nervously. "That night mission near Kandahar Air Base about 2 weeks before we rotated home. You remember that, right? The one where we weren't supposed to talk about what we saw. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I could suddenly recall creeping through a compound in complete darkness, hearing screams from a building we weren't supposed to enter, seeing things that haunted me more than any firefight or IED explosion. Tommy, what happened to our records? Why can't I find any documentation of our service? He walked back to the couch and sat down heavily, his beer forgotten on the coffee table. You need to stay quiet about Kandahar, Darwin. That operation never happened officially. A lot of guys who were there have had problems with their paperwork getting lost or reclassified. What operation? We were just on a routine patrol. No, we weren't, Tommy whispered. And if you're smart, you'll stop digging into this. Some powerful people have a lot of money invested in making sure certain stories never get told. Before I left Phoenix, Tommy gave me a phone number for our old platoon sergeant, Bill Crawford, who was living somewhere in North Carolina. He also handed me a business card for an investigative journalist named Susan Taylor, who worked for the Washington Post. If things get really bad, Tommy said as I climbed into my truck for the drive home, call her. She's been looking into military contractor corruption for years. But be careful, man. Be very, very careful. The drive back to Denver was filled with equal parts hope and terror. I had proof that I'd actually served, confirmation that my memories were real, but I also had the growing realization that my missing records weren't just bureaucratic incompetence. Someone had deliberately erased my military service, and now my own family was unknowingly helping to destroy what little credibility I had left. Whatever I'd witnessed during that classified night mission near Kandahar, it was apparently worth enough to powerful people that they'd go to extraordinary lengths to silence anyone who might talk about it. The question was whether I had the courage to keep fighting when the stakes were obviously much higher than a simple family lawsuit. Back in federal court, Bradshaw's presentation was a masterclass in legal destruction. He had charts, timelines, official documents, and testimony from multiple witnesses, all designed to paint me as a calculating fraud who had stolen valor from real veterans. Your Honor. Bradshaw began, his silver hair perfectly styled and his navy suit impeccable. The defendant, Darwin Miller, has perpetrated one of the most elaborate stolen valor schemes this court has ever seen. He has not only defrauded the American taxpayers out of hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent benefits, but he has dishonored every man and woman who has legitimately served our nation. The evidence was overwhelming and seemingly irrefutable. Multiple searches through Department of Defense personnel databases showed no record of any Darwin Miller serving in the United States Army during the time frame I claimed to be deployed. The Defense Personnel Records Information Retrieval System, which maintains records for all military personnel, came back empty. Social Security Administration records told a different story entirely. According to their wage and earning statements, I had been continuously employed in civilian jobs from age 18 through 24. During the exact period when I claimed to be serving in Afghanistan, SSA records showed me working at Colorado Tire and Auto, then later at Rocky Mountain Landscaping. But the most devastating evidence came when Bradshaw produced a manila folder containing documents I had never seen before. Inside were my original adoption papers from when I was 15 years old. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Bradshaw announced dramatically, Darwin Miller was not even Darwin Miller when he allegedly enlisted in the Army. He was born Daniel Morrison, and these are the legal documents proving his adoption into the Miller family. My heart stopped. I stared at those papers like they might burst into flames. According to the documentation, I had legally changed my name from Daniel Morrison to Darwin Miller when I turned 18, just 6 months before I claimed to have enlisted. Patricia took the witness stand looking like a grieving mother forced to expose her son's lies. She wore a conservative black dress and had her graying hair pulled back in a style that made her look older and more frail than her 58 years. This is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, she testified, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. But I can't watch my son continue to lie about his service when there are real veterans who sacrificed everything for this country. Her testimony was devastating. She described my adoption at age 15, after my biological parents died in a car accident. According to Patricia, I had always been a troubled child, with a tendency toward elaborate fantasies and attention-seeking behavior. Daniel, Darwin, was always making up stories about being a hero, she said through tears. When he turned 18 and legally changed his name, I thought it was just typical teenage rebellion. But then, he started telling people he'd enlisted in the army, and I believed him at first. Patricia testified that she had grown suspicious over the years, when my stories about military service kept changing. Sometimes, I claimed to be infantry, other times a mechanic or communication specialist. The timeline of my deployment shifted, depending on who I was talking to. I finally hired a private investigator to look into his claims, she continued. When we discovered there were no records of Darwin Miller serving in the military, and that Daniel Morrison had no service record either, I realized how deeply my son had lied to all of us. Roger took the stand next, his testimony equally damaging. My stepfather had always been a quiet, methodical man who worked for the Postal Service for 3 decades. His credibility was unquestionable, and his words carried the weight of someone who had never told a lie in his life. Darwin was a good kid, but he struggled with telling the truth, Roger said in his measured way. He would create these elaborate stories about adventures he'd been on, heroic things he'd done. When he moved out and started claiming he'd joined the military, Patricia and I were relieved. We thought the structure might help him mature. Roger's testimony included specific examples of inconsistencies in my military stories. He had kept a journal, he said, where he'd noted things I'd told them about my service. The entries showed contradictory information about my unit, my deployment location, and even the branch of service I claimed to have joined. Marcus, my half-brother, was clearly uncomfortable on the witness stand, but his testimony was perhaps the most damaging of all. At 27, he worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Colorado Springs and had never been in any kind of legal trouble. His reluctant honesty made his words even more credible. I love my brother, Marcus said quietly, but I've always known something was wrong with his military stories. The details never stayed consistent. He would talk about being deployed to Afghanistan, but then mention bases and locations that didn't match up with any research I could do online. Marcus testified that he had tried to connect with veterans groups in college, hoping to understand my experiences better. When he mentioned my supposed service to other veterans, they had pointed out inconsistencies in the stories I had told the family. One veteran told me that the unit Darwin claimed to serve with was actually deployed to Iraq, not Afghanistan, Marcus said. When I asked Darwin about it, he got angry and accused me of not supporting him. That's when I started to suspect he might not be telling the truth. The most painful moment came when Jessica took the witness stand. My girlfriend looked beautiful, but nervous in her blue dress, and I could see tears forming in her green eyes as she was sworn in. The prosecution had subpoenaed her as a witness, and her attorney had advised her to testify truthfully despite our relationship. Darwin has some memory issues related to his claimed PTSD, Jessica testified reluctantly. Sometimes he tells me stories about his deployment that don't quite make sense. Dates that don't line up, people whose names change from one telling to the next. She described incidents where I had woken up screaming from nightmares, but admitted that the content of those nightmares was often vague and nonspecific. According to Jessica, I had difficulty providing concrete details about my military service when she asked direct questions. I wanted to believe him, Jessica said through tears. But there were times when I wondered if maybe the trauma had affected his memory more than he realized. Or if maybe he had convinced himself that fantasies were real memories. Bradshaw's final piece of evidence was a report from a forensic psychiatrist who had reviewed my medical records and interviewed me under court order. Dr. Elizabeth Foster was a respected expert in trauma psychology who had testified in hundreds of cases involving false memory syndrome. In my professional opinion, Dr. Foster testified. The defendant exhibits classic signs of someone who has constructed elaborate false memories around a desired identity. His inability to provide consistent details about his alleged military service, combined with the complete lack of documentation, suggests a psychiatric condition rather than genuine service-related trauma. As I sat in the defendant's chair, watching my life get systematically destroyed, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. The evidence against me was so overwhelming that even I was starting to wonder if everyone might be right. Maybe I had somehow convinced myself that vivid fantasies were real memories. Maybe the PTSD symptoms were psychosomatic reactions to an imaginary trauma. But then, I would remember Tommy Patterson recognizing me, immediately calling me Danny Morrison, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I would remember Dr. Rodriguez's medical evidence, showing hearing damage consistent with combat exposure. Those fragments of truth kept me anchored to sanity when everything else seemed to be slipping away. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of them legitimate veterans who had come to watch a stolen valor case unfold. I could feel their anger and disgust directed at me, their conviction that I had dishonored their genuine sacrifices. Some wore military ball caps and unit patches, visual reminders of the authentic service I was accused of faking. When Bradshaw finished his presentation, the murmurs from the gallery were unmistakably hostile. "Stolen valor," I heard someone whisper. "Disgraceful," said another voice. The tide of public opinion had turned completely against me, and I couldn't blame anyone for believing the evidence. My attorney David Kim looked defeated as he prepared for his turn to present our defense. We had Dr. Rodriguez's medical testimony and my own recollections, but compared to the mountain of documentation Bradshaw had produced, our case seemed hopeless. As the judge called for a recess, I wondered if I should just give up and accept whatever judgment the court imposed. Fighting this case was destroying what little remained of my relationship with my family, costing me my job, and turning me into a pariah in the veteran community. But something deep inside me refused to surrender. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the absolute certainty that my memories of Afghanistan were real. Whatever it was, I knew I had to keep fighting, even if I was destined to lose. Something had been bothering me about my family's sudden decision to pursue this lawsuit. Patricia, Roger, and Marcus had never been wealthy, but over the past year, I'd noticed some significant changes in their financial situation that didn't add up. During a brief court recess, I followed Marcus as he left the federal building. My half-brother walked 3 blocks to a downtown parking garage, where I watched him get into a conversation with a man in an expensive charcoal suit. The stranger was tall and lean with perfectly styled silver hair, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. I positioned myself behind a concrete pillar, where I could overhear fragments of their conversation without being seen. What I heard made my blood run cold. "The family is performing exactly as expected," the silver-haired man said in a cultured East Coast accent. "Darwin's credibility is completely destroyed. Even if he recovers any memories about Kandahar, no jury will ever believe a proven fraud." Marcus looked uncomfortable as he accepted a thick envelope from the man. "I still don't feel right about this, Mr. Blackwood. Darwin's my brother, even if he is lying about his service." "Your brother is a threat to national security interests," Blackwood replied coldly. "What he thinks he remembers could damage relationships with valuable contractor partners in the Middle East. Your family is performing a patriotic service by ensuring his testimony remains discredited." After the men separated, I followed Blackwood to his vehicle, a black BMW with government plates. Before driving away, he made a phone call that I was close enough to overhear through his open window. "The Morrison situation is contained," he said to whoever was on the other end. "Blackstone Defense has invested too much in Afghan operations to let some infantry grunt's memories compromise our contracts. The family lawsuit should be sufficient to permanently neutralize his credibility." Blackstone Defense. I'd heard that name before, though I couldn't immediately place where. Back at my apartment that night, I spent hours researching the company online. What I found made everything click into place with terrifying clarity. Blackstone Defense Contractors was a massive private military company that had made billions from government contracts in Iraq and Afghanistan. They provided security services, logistics support, and specialized operations that regular military units couldn't or wouldn't handle. Their corporate headquarters was in Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., and their client list included virtually every major government agency involved in overseas operations. But Blackstone had also been the subject of numerous investigations over the years. Congressional hearings had revealed evidence of contractor misconduct, unauthorized detention of civilians, and what military investigators called excessive force incidents during operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. As I dug deeper into news archives and government reports, specific details began triggering memories I thought I had lost forever. That night mission near Kandahar Air Base wasn't just a routine patrol. We had been providing security for a Blackstone facility where they were interrogating suspected insurgents using methods that violated military regulations and international law. I remembered creeping through that compound in the darkness, hearing screams from a concrete building that we were ordered to stay away from. I remembered seeing Blackstone contractors dragging bloodied prisoners between cells, using techniques that would have been considered torture if performed by regular military personnel. Most importantly, I remembered filing a detailed report about what I had witnessed, submitting it through proper channels to our commanding officer. That report had disappeared within days, and I had been transferred to a different unit before our deployment ended. Now I understood why my military records had been erased, and why my family was being paid to destroy my credibility. Blackstone had spent billions establishing relationships with Afghan warlords and government officials' relationships that would be jeopardized if their illegal interrogation methods became public knowledge. The realization that my family was being manipulated and paid to betray me was almost more painful than the lawsuit itself. Patricia, Roger, and Marcus weren't evil people, but they were struggling financially and had been convinced they were helping expose a fraud. Blackstone had probably approached them with evidence of my missing military records and convinced them that prosecuting me was the patriotic thing to do. I needed help, but I didn't know who I could trust. Tommy Patterson had warned me to be careful, and now I understood why. If Blackstone was willing to pay my family to destroy me in court, they were certainly capable of much worse if they felt threatened. I decided to contact the investigative journalist Tommy had mentioned, Susan Taylor from the Washington Post. Her articles about military contractor corruption had exposed numerous scandals over the years, and she had the resources and connections to investigate Blackstone properly. Taylor agreed to meet me at a small diner outside Denver, far from downtown, where Blackstone operatives might be watching. She was a woman in her 40s, with short brown hair and intense brown eyes that suggested she'd seen enough corruption to last several lifetimes. "I've been investigating Blackstone for 8 years," she told me as we sat in a corner booth away from other customers. "They're one of the most powerful private military companies in the world, and they have enough political connections to make problems disappear." I told her everything: my missing military records, Tommy's warnings about Kandahar, the conversation I'd overheard between Marcus and Blackwood, and my recovering memories of the night mission, where I'd witnessed contractor misconduct. Taylor listened intently, taking notes in a small notebook that she kept partially hidden under the table. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes before responding. "What you're describing matches patterns I've documented in 17 other cases," she finally said. "Blackstone has been systematically discrediting military personnel who witnessed their illegal operations overseas. Some veterans have had their records reclassified as classified, others have faced criminal charges on fabricated evidence, and a few have simply disappeared." She showed me a folder containing copies of documents from her ongoing investigation. Page after page detailed Blackstone's efforts to silence witnesses, bribe officials, and cover up evidence of war crimes committed by their contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan. "The problem is proving it," Taylor explained. Blackstone has unlimited resources and protection from the highest levels of government. They can make records disappear, buy false testimony, and destroy the credibility of anyone who threatens their operations. But Taylor had been working on something that might help. She had been building a case with the help of a retired Army colonel who had been investigating Blackstone's Afghan operations for years. This colonel had access to classified documents that could prove my service record and possibly expose the conspiracy to silence veterans. "There's someone you need to meet," Taylor said as we prepared to leave the diner. "But it has to be done very carefully. If Blackstone realizes we're building a case against them, both of us could end up like some of the other witnesses who've disappeared." As I drove home that night, I realized the lawsuit was just the beginning of my problems. I wasn't just fighting to clear my name or recover my military benefits. I was up against one of the most powerful private military contractors in the world, a company that had billions of dollars invested in keeping their war crimes secret. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. Susan Taylor believed my story, and she had resources that might be able to expose the truth about what Blackstone had done to me and other veterans. The question was whether we could build our case before Blackstone realized how close we were getting to the truth. My family's lawsuit was scheduled to resume in just 2 weeks, and if I lost that case, my credibility would be permanently destroyed. Whatever happened next, I knew there was no turning back. The fight for my reputation had become something much bigger, a fight for justice for all the veterans that Blackstone had silenced over the years. When court resumed the following Monday, I expected more of the same devastating testimony that had been destroying my case for weeks. Instead, something unprecedented happened that changed the entire trajectory of the trial. As Judge Sarah Williams prepared to call the court to order, she stood up slowly behind the bench with an expression I'd never seen before. Her usually stern demeanor had been replaced by something that looked almost like barely contained anger. "Before we continue with today's proceedings," she announced in a voice that commanded absolute attention, "I need to address some matters that have come to my attention regarding this case." The courtroom fell completely silent. Bradshaw looked confused. My attorney David Kim appeared nervous, and my family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even the court reporter stopped typing and looked up expectantly. Judge Williams reached up and began removing her black judicial robe, revealing the uniform underneath. But it wasn't just any uniform. She was wearing the dress blue uniform of a United States Army colonel, complete with ribbons, badges, and insignia that indicated extensive combat experience. The entire courtroom gasped. Patricia actually stood up in shock before Roger pulled her back down into her seat. Marcus looked like he'd seen a ghost, and Bradshaw's face had gone completely pale. For those who may not recognize these insignia, Judge Williams continued her voice, now carrying the unmistakable authority of a senior military officer. "I am retired Colonel Sarah Williams, United States Army. I served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, including 18 months in the Kandahar region, during the exact time frame that Mr. Miller claims to have been deployed there." She called for an immediate recess and requested that all attorneys meet her in chambers. As we filed into her private office behind the courtroom, I could see military commendations and photographs covering the walls. Pictures of Judge Williams in combat gear, standing with various units in desert environments that looked exactly like the Afghanistan I remembered. "Gentlemen," she began once the door was closed, "I have been listening to testimony about Mr. Miller's alleged fabrication of military service, but I have significant concerns about the direction this case has taken." She walked to a file cabinet and retrieved a thick folder marked with classification stamps. "During my service in Afghanistan, I conducted extensive investigations into contractor operations in the Kandahar region. I am intimately familiar with classified missions that took place near Kandahar Air Base, particularly those involving Blackstone defense contractors." Bradshaw tried to object, but Judge Williams cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. "Mr. Miller," she said, turning to face me directly, I'm going to ask you some very specific questions about your claimed service. If you are lying about your deployment, these questions will expose that immediately. But if you are telling the truth, you should be able to answer them with details that only someone who actually served there would know. For the next hour, Judge Williams grilled me about military protocols, base layouts, unit call signs, and operational procedures specific to Kandahar province. She asked about everything from the color of the dining facility walls to the sound of the morning call to prayer echoing from nearby villages. I answered every question correctly, often providing details that surprised even her. When she asked about the IED incident that had damaged my hearing, I described the exact location, the type of device, and even the name of the medic who had treated me afterward. "Dr. Jensen," I said without hesitation. Navy corpsman attached to our unit, had a tattoo of an anchor on his left forearm, and always carried extra medical supplies because he didn't trust the standard field kits. Judge Williams nodded slowly, making notes in a legal pad. "Continue about the night mission you mentioned in your deposition, the one near the Blackstone facility." As I described what I had witnessed during that classified operation, Judge Williams's expression grew increasingly grave. I told her about seeing Blackstone contractors using interrogation techniques that violated the Geneva Conventions, about filing reports that disappeared, and about being transferred to a different unit before I could follow up on my complaints. "Mr. Miller," she said when I finished, "the operation you've just described was the subject of a classified investigation that I personally conducted. Everything you've told me matches classified reports that were filed by multiple witnesses, including detailed descriptions of contractor misconduct that were never made public." She turned to face Bradshaw, whose expensive suit could no longer hide the fact that he was sweating profusely. "Mr. Bradshaw, I'm curious about how your clients discovered Mr. Miller's alleged fraud. Who brought this case to your attention, and who is funding this lawsuit?" Bradshaw stammered something about his clients being concerned citizens, but Judge Williams wasn't satisfied with his evasive answer. "Let me be more specific," she continued. "Have you or your clients received any financial assistance, legal guidance, or evidence from Blackstone Defense Contractors or any of their affiliated companies?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Bradshaw's face had gone from pale to green, and he was clearly struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't perjure himself. Judge Williams didn't wait for his answer. She walked to her desk and picked up a secure phone that had a direct line to military intelligence contacts. "Colonel Martinez," she said when someone answered. "This is Sarah Williams. I need you to declassify the investigation files on Operation Kandahar cleanup immediately. I'm sending over a federal court order within the hour." She hung up the phone and turned back to address everyone in the room. "Gentlemen, this case is about to take a very different direction. Mr. Miller's military service records were deliberately suppressed under classified protocols, not lost due to bureaucratic error. His testimony about contractor misconduct matches classified reports that have been sealed for national security reasons. Judge Williams had spent years investigating the very crimes I had witnessed, and she had been waiting for an opportunity to bring justice to veterans who had been silenced for speaking the truth about contractor abuses. The reason Mr. Miller's records cannot be found under his current name is because he was serving under his birth name, Daniel Morrison, before he legally changed his identity. His service record, along with his commendations and injury reports, exist in classified files that have been deliberately buried to protect contractor interests. As we prepared to return to the courtroom, Judge Williams made it clear that she intended to expose the truth about what had happened to me and other veterans who had been silenced by Blackstone. "This trial is no longer about stolen valor," she announced. "It's about a systematic conspiracy to discredit military personnel who witnessed war crimes committed by private contractors. And I intend to see that justice is finally served." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. Judge Williams had the authority, the knowledge, and the determination to expose the truth that Blackstone had spent years trying to bury. But I also knew that taking on a company as powerful as Blackstone would be extremely dangerous for everyone involved, including a federal judge who had just declared war on one of the most influential military contractors in the world. The courtroom was packed to capacity when Judge Williams reconvened the proceedings. Word had spread about the dramatic revelations from the previous day, and local news crews were positioned outside the federal building, hoping to catch a glimpse of what had become a nationally significant case. Judge Williams had used her military connections to expedite the declassification of documents that had been buried for nearly a decade. As the bailiff wheeled in boxes of evidence, I could see Bradshaw becoming increasingly agitated, while the man I now knew was Blackwood sat rigidly in the gallery, his phone constantly buzzing with urgent calls. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Williams began, "new evidence has come to light that fundamentally alters the nature of this case. What began as accusations of stolen valor has revealed itself to be something far more serious, a systematic conspiracy to discredit American veterans who witnessed criminal misconduct by defense contractors overseas." My attorney David Kim, who had seemed defeated just days earlier, now stood confidently as he addressed the court. Judge Williams had provided him with documentation that transformed our hopeless defense into an overwhelming counterattack. "Your Honor, I present to the court the military service record of Daniel Morrison, who later legally changed his name to Darwin Miller," Kim announced, holding up a thick file marked with official Department of Defense seals. These records, previously classified under national security protocols, document Specialist Morrison's decorated service with the 2nd Infantry Division in Afghanistan from 2008 to 2009. The documents were devastating to Blackstone's case. My DD, 214 discharge papers, medical records documenting my hearing loss, and even commendation letters from my commanding officers were all there, officially stamped and verified by military personnel departments. But the most damaging evidence was the detailed report I had filed about the Blackstone contractor facility near Kandahar Air Base. Judge Williams had declassified not only my report, but also similar reports filed by 6 other soldiers who had witnessed the same illegal interrogation activities. This investigation, Judge Williams testified stepping down from the bench to address the jury directly, documented systematic violations of international law by Blackstone defense contractors. Mr. Miller was one of several witnesses whose testimony could have resulted in criminal prosecutions and the loss of billions in government contracts. She presented evidence showing how Blackstone had systematically suppressed the military records of witnesses, bribed officials to reclassify documents, and in some cases arranged for false criminal charges to be filed against veterans who refused to stay silent about what they had seen. The plaintiff's lawsuit against Mr. Miller is not the result of family concern about fraudulent benefits, Judge Williams continued. It is the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy the credibility of a key witness in potential war crimes prosecutions. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as Judge Williams played recorded phone conversations between Blackstone operatives and Marcus Miller. The recordings obtained through military intelligence channels clearly showed Blackwood offering financial incentives to the family in exchange for filing the lawsuit and providing false testimony about my character. Marcus looked physically ill as his own voice played through the courtroom speakers. In one particularly damaging conversation, Blackwood was heard saying, "Your brother's memories of Kandahar could cost us hundreds of millions in lost contracts. We need him discredited permanently." Patricia had begun crying softly as she realized how completely they had been manipulated. The family had genuinely believed they were exposing a fraud, but they had actually been pawns in a corporate conspiracy to silence whistleblowers. The most shocking moment came when the courtroom's video screens activated to display a live video conference call from an undisclosed location. The face that appeared on screen was weathered and tired, but unmistakably familiar. "Captain Bradley Thompson," the man announced, "United States Army reporting for duty, Your Honor." The entire courtroom fell silent. According to official records, Captain Thompson had been killed in a vehicle accident 3 years earlier. But here he was, very much alive, and ready to testify about the cover-up that had forced him into hiding. I faked my death. Thompson testified via video link, because Blackstone operatives made it clear that I would not survive if I continued pushing for prosecutions related to their contractor misconduct in Afghanistan. They had already arranged for false criminal charges against 2 other officers who supported the investigation. Thompson's testimony corroborated everything I had remembered about the night mission and the subsequent cover-up. As my commanding officer, he had submitted my reports through proper channels, only to watch them disappear within days of filing. Specialist Morrison was one of the finest soldiers I ever commanded, Thompson testified. His reports about contractor misconduct were detailed, accurate, and supported by multiple witnesses. The fact that his service record was classified and buried shows how desperate powerful interests were to silence him. But Blackstone wasn't finished fighting. As Thompson's testimony concluded, federal agents who had been positioned throughout the courtroom suddenly moved into action. The FBI had been secretly coordinating with Judge Williams to gather evidence of Blackstone's criminal conspiracy, and they had been waiting for the right moment to strike. Blackwood was arrested as he attempted to leave the courthouse, charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice witness, intimidation, and bribery of federal court proceedings. 2 other Blackstone operatives, who had been monitoring the trial, were taken into custody along with him. The arrests created chaos in the courtroom, but Judge Williams maintained order as she addressed the jury one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have witnessed is not just the vindication of one veteran's service record. You have seen evidence of a criminal conspiracy that has silenced multiple witnesses to war crimes and corrupted our judicial system to protect corporate interests. As news crews outside the courthouse began reporting the dramatic arrests and revelations, I felt a mixture of vindication and exhaustion that was almost overwhelming. The truth about my service was finally public, but the cost of reaching this point had been enormous. Patricia approached me during the recess, her face streaked with tears, and her voice barely above a whisper. "Darwin, I'm so sorry," she said, reaching out to touch my arm. "We thought we were doing the right thing. They showed us documents, convinced us you were lying to get benefits you didn't deserve." Roger stood beside her, looking older than his 60 years, and visibly shaken by the revelations about how completely they had been manipulated. "Son, we should have trusted you," he said simply. "We should have known you weren't capable of the kind of lies they accused you of." Marcus was the hardest to face because I could see how much guilt he was carrying about his role in the conspiracy. As an accountant, he was detail-oriented and methodical, which made his realization that he'd been completely fooled even more painful. "They targeted me specifically," he explained through tears. "Said I was the smart one in the family, the one who would see through your lies. They played on my jealousy about your military service and convinced me I was protecting the family from a fraud." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a complete vindication. They not only dismissed all charges against me, but also awarded damages for defamation, emotional distress, and legal costs. More importantly, they found that Blackstone defense contractors had engaged in a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice, and recommended that federal prosecutors pursue additional charges. As we left the courthouse that evening, Susan Taylor was waiting with updates on her expanding investigation into Blackstone's activities. The dramatic courtroom revelations had opened floodgates of evidence from other veterans who had been silenced over the years. "This is just the beginning," she told me as news cameras captured our conversation. "Congressional hearings are already being scheduled, and the Justice Department has opened a formal investigation into Blackstone's contractor operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan." But the victory felt bittersweet. I had proven my military service and exposed the conspiracy against me, but the damage to my relationships and reputation would take years to fully repair. More importantly, other veterans who had been silenced by Blackstone were still fighting their own battles for recognition and justice. As I stood on the courthouse steps watching the sun set over Denver, I realized that winning this case was only the first step in a much larger fight. Blackstone and companies like them had operated with impunity for too long, destroying the lives of veterans who had served their country honorably and then tried to speak truth about what they had witnessed overseas. The little infantry grunt from Denver had just taken on one of the most powerful military contractors in the world and won. But the real victory would come when every veteran silenced by corporate interests finally received the justice they deserved. 3 months after the trial ended, I stood in the same federal courthouse where my family had tried to destroy me. But this time, I was there to receive a formal apology from the United States government and acknowledgement of my military service. The ceremony was attended by dozens of other veterans who had been silenced by Blackstone over the years, their own service records finally restored through the congressional investigation that my case had triggered. Judge Williams, now retired from the bench and working as a military justice advocate, administered the oath that officially reinstated my status as a combat veteran. Specialist Daniel Morrison, also known as Darwin Miller. She announced to the assembled crowd, "Your service to our nation in Afghanistan has been officially recognized and restored. Your Bronze Star for valor during the Kandahar incident is hereby presented with full military honors." The medal was the same one I had earned for protecting Afghan civilians during the night mission, where I had witnessed Blackstone's illegal activities. It had been classified, along with my service record, but now it could finally be displayed publicly as recognition of what I had sacrificed for my country. The FBI's investigation into Blackstone had expanded far beyond my individual case, revealing a systematic pattern of witness intimidation, record manipulation, and judicial corruption that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of veteran cases. Congressional hearings led by Senator Patricia Martinez had exposed the full scope of the conspiracy and resulted in criminal charges against 17 Blackstone executives. Blackwood himself had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. More importantly, Blackstone defense contractors had lost their government security clearances and been barred from receiving any new federal contracts, effectively ending their operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The settlement I received from the civil lawsuit against Blackstone was substantial enough to change my life completely, but I had decided to use most of it to establish a foundation, helping other veterans whose service records had been suppressed or manipulated by defense contractors. The Veterans Truth Foundation, operating out of a small office in downtown Denver, had already helped restore the service records of 43 veterans in just its first 6 months of operation. Susan Taylor served on our board of directors, using her investigative skills to track down witnesses and documentary evidence that proved each veteran's legitimate service. Tommy Patterson had emerged from hiding after Blackstone's downfall, and now worked as our field investigator, connecting with veterans across the country who had been afraid to come forward during the company's reign of intimidation. His military experience and understanding of contractor operations made him invaluable in identifying cases where corporate interests had silenced legitimate whistleblowers. Captain Thompson, no longer forced to live under an assumed identity, had returned to active duty and was spearheading military reforms designed to prevent contractor abuses in future overseas operations. His survival and testimony had been crucial in exposing the full scope of Blackstone's criminal activities. The most meaningful aspect of my vindication was the restoration of my relationship with my family. Patricia, Roger, and Marcus had all undergone counseling to deal with the guilt and trauma of being manipulated into betraying someone they loved. "We should have trusted our instincts about you," Patricia told me during one of our weekly dinners at her house in Colorado Springs. "Deep down, we knew you weren't capable of the kind of lies they accused you of, but they were so convincing with their evidence and their patriotic rhetoric." Roger had become one of my strongest supporters, using his decades of experience with federal bureaucracy to help other veterans navigate the complex process of record restoration. His methodical approach and attention to detail made him perfect for documenting the evidence needed to prove legitimate service. Marcus had perhaps been the most affected by the revelation of how completely he had been manipulated. As someone who prided himself on analytical thinking, discovering that he had been played by professional operatives had shaken his confidence in his own judgment. "They targeted my specific personality type," he explained during one of our conversations. "They knew I was jealous of your military service and used that against both of us. I'm just grateful we were able to rebuild our relationship after everything that happened." Jessica and I had also reconciled our relationship stronger, now that it was built on complete honesty about what I had experienced during my deployment. She had struggled with guilt about doubting my military service, but I helped her understand that even I had begun questioning my own memories under the pressure of Blackstone's sophisticated manipulation campaign. The Veterans Administration had not only restored my disability benefits, but also provided additional counseling and medical care to address the psychological trauma of being systematically gaslit about my own military experience. Dr. Rodriguez continued to serve as my psychiatrist, but now our sessions focused on healing from the conspiracy rather than questioning the reality of my service. The broader impact of my case extended far beyond individual vindications. Congressional legislation now required defense contractors to maintain detailed records of their interactions with military personnel and prohibited the classification of service records for reasons unrelated to operational security. New whistleblower protections ensured that veterans reporting contractor misconduct could not have their records manipulated or suppressed. Military justice reforms implemented in response to the Blackstone scandal established independent oversight of contractor operations and created clear channels for reporting misconduct without fear of retaliation. These changes would protect future generations of service members from the kind of systematic intimidation that had silenced so many Afghanistan and Iraq veterans. The investigative journalism awards that Susan Taylor received for exposing the Blackstone conspiracy helped establish new standards for reporting on military contractor corruption. Her work had inspired a new generation of journalists to investigate the intersection of private military companies and government oversight. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was seeing justice served against the individuals who had participated in the conspiracy to destroy veteran witnesses. Beyond Blackwood's prison sentence, 12 other Blackstone executives received federal convictions for their roles in the witness intimidation campaign. The night I received my restored military decorations, I stood in my apartment looking at the Bronze Star that had been hidden from me for nearly 10 years. The medal represented not just my service in Afghanistan, but also the determination to keep fighting for truth even when everyone around me had been convinced I was lying. My phone buzzed with a text message from Tommy Patterson, who was investigating a new case in North Carolina involving 3 Marines whose service records had disappeared after they reported contractor abuses in Iraq. Another family just contacted the foundation. Tommy's message read, "3 brothers, all Marines, all discredited after reporting war crimes. Same pattern as Blackstone. Ready to fight for them." I looked at my Bronze Star one more time, then put it carefully in the display case next to my restored DD-214 discharge papers. The fight for my own recognition was over, but the fight for justice for other silenced veterans would continue for years to come. As I prepared for another day of helping veterans reclaim their stolen honor, I reflected on the lesson that had emerged from this entire ordeal. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how powerful the forces trying to suppress it. Corporate interests and government corruption can silence witnesses temporarily, but they cannot erase the fundamental integrity of people who have served their country with honor. The young carpenter from Denver, who had been accused of stolen valor, was gone, replaced by someone who understood the price of standing up to institutional power and the responsibility that comes with surviving a systematic attempt to destroy your credibility. Every veteran whose service record we restored, every family reunited after being torn apart by corporate manipulation, and every reform implemented to prevent future abuses represented a small victory in the larger war for accountability and justice. The Foundation's work was just beginning, but I knew we would continue fighting until every veteran silenced by defense contractor corruption received the recognition and respect they had earned through their service to our nation. Have you ever had to fight to prove something true about yourself when everyone around you believed lies? How do you think you would handle being systematically gaslit about your own experiences by powerful interests? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe for more stories about justice and redemption, and share it with anyone who believes in standing up for what's right. Thank you for listening. And remember that truth and integrity will always outlast the forces trying to suppress them.